Hence it came to pass that these nations sent out a savory report to all the neighboring Reformed churches, a report which comforted, revived, strengthened, animated, and encouraged all the true and loyal subjects of Christ's kingdom, which struck terror and amazement to the hearts of his enemies, which shook and caused to tremble the pillars of Antichrist's kingdom, and disquieted the very foundations of the seat of that beast, which made malignants at home and abroad to be ashamed and confounded, and even forced the haters of the Lord to feign submission to him. Numberless were the advantages and privileges which did redound to these nations by and where the lovely attendance and sweet consequence of these covenants, whereby God did set to his seal of approbation, and gave clear evidence and demonstration of his acceptance of his people's cheerful and willing adventures in this duty of covenanting with him. And as these blessings and mercies, which as the dew of Hermon were distilled upon his people's heads and hearts, while they abode steadfast with him, and faithful in his covenant, were so many irrefragable proofs of his acquiescence in their first and laudable undertakings, so the many sad and fearful plagues, distractions, confusions, and miseries which have attended and followed the many gross breaches and violations of these covenants and departures from God are no less evident discoveries, undeniable signs, and pregnant convictions of the Lord's most just displeasure and indignation with the bypast and present courses of revolting and backsliding from him, which courses of declension and grievous apostatizing from God and his covenant, all the three kingdoms, and in special this nation, and every individual therein, capable of such a work is, without all controversy, called to bewail and confess before God, and by speedy amendment to turn from them, in order to avert judgments and turn away justly impendent wrath and long-threatened strokes. The consideration of these blessings and benefits, on the one hand, which followed the zealous entering into and sincere performing of these sacred oaths, and upon the other hand, the sense we desire to retain of the plagues and curses threatened by God and his word against covenant breaking, inflicted upon covenant breakers in former ages and foreign nations, and visibly impending upon us in these nations, for our perfidious dealing in God's covenant, hath moved us a poor insignificant handful of people, unworthy indeed to be called the posterity of our zealous reforming ancestors, though heartily desirous to be found adherers to the same standard of doctrine, worship, discipline, and government to which they adhered, to attempt this solemn and weighty duty of renewing, in our capacities and stations, these covenant obligations, that we might at least give some discovery of our respect to the cause of God, for the advancement and preservation whereof these covenants were first entered into, and afterwards again and again renewed by our religious progenitors, and by the whole representative body of the three kingdoms, who had any zeal for the interest of religion, and that we might, for our parts, be in some measure instrumental to transmit a testimony for the work of God in our land to the succeeding generation. Neither do we want, beside these general motives, some special inducements to this undertaking, as first, because these national covenants have been nationally broken, and their funeral piles, erected by wicked and perfidious rulers in their capital cities of the kingdom, with all imaginable ignominy and contempt, have long lain buried, and almost quite forgotten under these ashes, most people either hating the very name and remembrance of them, or at least being ashamed honorably to avouch their adherence to them, and afraid to endeavor a vigorous and constant prosecution of the duties contained in them. So that it's high time that everyone should do his outmost towards a reviving of them. Secondly, because many openly declare their sorrow and grief that ever these covenants should have been entered into, malignants calling them a conspiracy, attributing every miscarriage of the persons engaged in them to the covenants themselves as their native effects. And others, who would take it ill to be called malignants, make them the causes of all the tyranny, rapine, bloodshed, and persecution of the late reigns, as having raised the spleen of the enemies of religion, and accounting it safer that they should lie still in their graves than that they should irritate malignants any more by their resurrection. Therefore we judge it our duty to renew them, that we might evidence that notwithstanding all these malignants' calumnies and false consequences cast upon them, we are still of the same judgment with our reformers, that they are the most sovereign means, under the blessing of God, for reviving and preserving the work of God in the land. Thirdly, because of the courses that are carried on in direct opposition to these covenants, the nations formerly cemented in peace and love in conjunction with truth and righteousness, having broken these bonds and united themselves upon another footing, by the late sinful incorporating union, and imposing new oaths in opposition to the covenant, such as the abjuration, etc., granting license, protection, and toleration to all the evils abjured in the covenant, as heresies and errors in doctrine, superstition in worship, prelacy and Erastianism in government, and overthrowing all good discipline. Fourthly, because of our own sinful miscarriages in and woeful declinings from our covenanted duties, our proneness to break covenant with God, and to be indifferent, lax, negligent, and unsteadfast in the cause and work of God, and to be led away with the error of the wicked, and to fall from our steadfastness. Wherefore we thought it necessary to bind ourselves by a new tie to the Lord, and one to another in a zealous prosecution of covenanted duties, that the covenant might be as a hedge to keep us from running out into the paths of destroyers. Fifthly, we being sincerely desirous and having an earnest longing to celebrate the sacred ordinance of the Lord's Supper, whereof many had unjustly called us despisers and contemners, and finding it to have been the laudable practice of the Church of Scotland formerly, that all such as were admitted to that holy table should swear and subscribe the covenant before their coming thereunto, we judged it a fit preparative for our receiving a sacramental communion of God's covenanted love and favor to us, through our Lord Jesus Christ, that we should avouch him for our God, and testify our adherence to his cause in truth, by our renewing of our national covenants with him. Upon these and the like weighty considerations we resolved to set about this solemn and tremendous duty, and being assured that we have no sufficiency in ourselves for any such undertaking, after frequent imploring the Lord for light and direction, strength and assistance, and seeking for ourselves a right way in the performance of the duty, upon days of humiliation, both in our private societies and publicly in the fields, we did condescend upon the following acknowledgement of sins, and more to enable us to remember our own and the land's breaches of covenant in our solemn public confession thereof, and to draw up the following engagement to duties, not to superadd any new oath and obligation to the covenants, but only to adjust the articles of the covenant to the circumstances of the time, and to explain in what sense the covenant binds us against the present evils that are now prevalent in the land, and to the contrary duties. As for the covenants themselves, we have made no material alteration in them, as judging it a work more proper for an assembly of divines or representative body of church and state, had they been upright and faithful in this cause, than for us, who, as we are called by others in contempt, must own ourselves in truth to be but a handful of weak and mostly illiterate people, and but as babes in comparison of the first framers of our covenants, only that we might make them in some measure accommodable to the present lamentable circumstances whereunto we are involved by our iniquities. We have annotated some few necessary alterations upon the margent, wherein the judicious will find that we have in nothing receded from the scope and substance of the covenants, but only in the phrase. For instance, where the covenant binds to the defense and preservation of the king's majesty and government, in regard we have no king, nor supreme civil magistrate, so qualified as God's law, and the laudable laws of this realm require, to whom we might, for conscience sake, subject ourselves in a consistency with our defending the true Reformed religion in all its parts and privileges. Therefore we can only bind ourselves to defend and preserve the honor, authority, and majesty of lawful sovereigns, or supreme magistrates having the qualifications aforesaid, when God shall be pleased to grant them to us. Where no judicious person will say that there is any substantial alteration as to the matter of duty, but only as to the object to whom the duty is to be performed, there being none such in being as can justly claim, or to whom we may with a good conscience pay such an allegiance. Having mutually agreed concerning these prerequisites to this sacred action, that the same might be orderly gone about, and might not be performed in a clandestine way, so as to preclude any upright-hearted friends to the covenanted Reformation from joining with us in that so necessary a duty, there was public intimation made of the design, a competent space of time before, upon a day of humiliation, and likewise upon the Lord's Day immediately preceding the work. As for the particular way and manner, method, and circumstances of the work, we have not given any narrative of them, but that some, who came with an evil eye to spy out our liberty, for criticizing, not for joining or profiting, have in part misrepresented the same, and may further do so. Therefore, to obviate all such misreports, we have thought it fit to make this brief relation thereof. Upon Wednesday, July 23rd, these that had the work and design being met together, the minister began the day's work with prayer for special assistance to attain due preparation for and a suitable frame throughout the whole of the solemnity, and thereafter had a prefatory discourse to the people, showing the nature of the work in general, its lawfulness, expediency, and necessity from Scripture precedents, and to proven examples of the people of God, adducing the 9th chapter of Ezra, Nehemiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Nehemiah 10, verse 28 and 29, for proof thereof, and of the day in particular, that it was a day of fasting and supplication, with preaching of the word, in order to preparation for the solemnities intended, both of renewing the covenants and celebrating the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, after which a part of the 78th Psalm, from the 5th to the 12th verse being sung, Mr. John McNeil, preacher of the gospel, had a sermon upon Jeremiah 50, verses 4 and 5, quote, "In those days and in that time, saith the Lord, the children of Israel shall come, they and the children of Judah together, going and weeping. They shall go and seek the Lord their God. And they shall ask the way to Zion with their faces thitherward, saying, Come and let us join ourselves to the Lord, in a perpetual covenant that shall not be forgotten." Unquote. From which text he raised and prosecuted largely and particularly those two following observations, and most pertinent for the work of the day. The first implicitly supposed, the other more explicitly asserted in these words, that is, first, that a people in covenant with God may be forgetful of and deal falsely in their covenant, or that covenant takers may be covenant breakers. And secondly, that it is the duty of a people who have broken covenant with God to engage themselves again to the Lord by the renovation of their covenant. Where, in prosecuting the former, he shows by what gradual steps of declension a people usually come to deal falsely in God's covenant, such as, firstly, by forgetfulness, Deuteronomy 4:23, there being a connection between forgetting and forsaking, or dealing falsely in God's covenant. So the church intimates, Psalm 44, verses 17 and 18, quote, "All this has come upon us, yet have we not forgotten thee, neither have we dealt falsely in thy covenant. Our heart is not turned back, neither have our steps declined from thy way." Unquote. And the returning remnant of Israel, being sensible of this connection, resolved to bind themselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that may never be forgotten. Secondly, by seeking shifts and arguments to elude and evade the obligation of the covenant, and to defend the breaches thereof, which is after vows to make inquiry. Thirdly, by despising the bond of it, Ezekiel 16, verse 59, quote, "Which hast despised the oath in breaking the covenant." Unquote. Fourthly, by defection to the iniquities which are sworn and engaged against in the covenant, Jeremiah 11:10, quote, "They are turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers, which refused to hear my words, and they went after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenant, which I made with their fathers." Unquote. Fifthly, by changing the government, laws, and ordinances sworn to be maintained in that covenant, either the government of the state without consulting divine direction and due inspection into the qualification of the persons set up, Hosea 8, compare the 1st and the 4th verses, quote, "They have transgressed my covenant," etc. "They have set up kings, but not by me, princes, and I knew it not." Unquote. That is, without consulting me to know my will, and without my approbation and consent, or the government of the church, without regard to the revealed will of God. Thus Abijah justly chargeth Jeroboam that he had, quote, "cast out the priests of the Lord, the sons of Aaron and the Levites," unquote, and that he had, quote, "made priests after the manner of the nations of other lands," unquote, but encourages himself that he and Judah had the Lord for their God, because, quote, "they had not forsaken him, and the priests which ministered unto the Lord were of the sons of Aaron," unquote. 2 Chronicles 13, verses 9 and 10. Sixthly, by an entire forsaking and disowning the obligation of the covenant, Daniel 11, verse 30, quote, "He shall have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant," unquote. Seventhly, by a stated opposition to the covenant, and persecuting of these who adhere thereunto. Thus Elijah justly charges Israel in 1 Kings 19, verse 10, quote, "that they had forsaken God's covenant because they had thrown down his altars, slain his prophets, and sought after Elijah's life," unquote. And in a use of lamentation deduced from the foresaid doctrine, he showed that all ranks in the land had reason to mourn over their breach of covenant, in regard that some of all ranks, from the throne to the dunghill, in church and state, are or have been guilty of dealing falsely in God's covenant, in all and every one of these diverse ways, and of declining from it, and in regard that there had been so much ignominy and contempt cast upon these sacred covenants, not only by breaking them openly, but also avowedly disowning and disdaining their obligation, and making the adherence to them criminal, which is above all, burning them by the hand of the hangman, and burying them so long in forgetfulness, this guiltiness be applied not to great persons only, but also to professors, to ministers, and particularly to ourselves, who are called dissenters from the present establishment, pressing upon us, no less than others, the absolute and indispensable necessity of being convinced of and mourning over these, not as the sins of others only, but also as our own, we having a chief hand in the trespass, pressing upon all present, concerned in the work, the duty of self-examination, and putting themselves to the trial concerning their knowledge of the covenant obligations, both as to their nature and extent, as well as their sense of the breaches of these obligations.